Hi, I'm Jesse Hirsh. Welcome to the Future Herd. Early on in this episode's discussion, Jamie Reaume describes himself this way. I'm a rebel. I'm a radical. I'm a free thinker and not a lemming. After nearly 3 decades working around Canada's agri-food sector, that's the identity he embraces. And it's an important one, because the Future Herd isn't just about celebrating leadership inside the agri-food system. It's also about creating space for the voices that challenge it, the people willing to question assumptions, push institutions, and insist that the sector confront difficult realities about its future. Jamie is one of those voices. In our conversation, he reflects on what he has learned from decades inside the agricultural sector. Why so many of the conversations feel stuck, why long-standing problems remain unresolved, and why independent thinking matters if agriculture is going to navigate the decades ahead. At one point, he sums up the motivation that has driven his work for so long. I fight for farmers and for a food system that I want to see just and fair for everyone. That tension between loyalty to the sector and a willingness to challenge it runs throughout this episode. Because if the Future Herd is going to think seriously about leadership and the future of food, it also needs to listen to the rebels sitting at the table. Hi, Jamie, and welcome to Future Herd.
Thank you, Jesse. I'm really happy to be here with you.
Jamie, I invited you to be part of the Future Herd in no small part to recognize the leadership that you've been providing to the agricultural sector for decades now, but also because I think you deserve a space here in the origins of this podcast, because this podcast came out of an event put on by the Agricultural Adaptation Council in September of 2025 on Agri-Food 2050. And at this event, I was on the stage insisting that the leadership of the sector needs to spend more time listening to dissidents, sitting at the same table with dissidents. And lo and behold, you were one of those dissidents in the room. And that's part of how you and I met, how you and I got along, and I think we've fast become friends. So I want to start today's conversation with a two-parter. Jamie, why don't you give us a brief one-sentence introduction? And do you identify, are you offended that I've identified you as a dissident within the agricultural food sector?
Real quickly, I've been doing this for nearly 3 decades. In a simple sentence, I fight for farmers and for a food system that I want to see just and fair for everyone, including the fact that I'm a parent and a grandparent. And that really is important to me because the conversation, as I've found out for some time now, has not changed since I started. And that shows me a definitive lack of any kind of clarity or plan. Would I identify as look, I'm a rebel, I'm a radical, I have been called all kinds of stuff since I started the industry. And it's all appropriate because I'm a free thinker and not a lemming. And I think that's what gets people is that at some point in my history, I was never somebody that followed the pack. I just chose to do what I thought was in the best interest, and more importantly, based on knowledge and information, what was right and appropriate at the time.
And this is where one of the purposes of this podcast is not just to speak to leaders in the sector, but to speak to the public, to speak to people who want to know where their food comes from. And, you're a model of a leader that, quite frankly, rarely exists outside of the agricultural sector. Because on the one hand, your bona fides are undeniable. You've literally been the executive in major key organizations, certainly within Ontario's agri-food food system, but arguably within Canada's as well. And to your point, you are a radical, you are a rebel, you are someone who speaks your mind. And this is a dynamic of leadership within the agricultural sector that I know outsiders don't understand. But I think even leaders within the sector themselves perhaps take for granted, which is just how combative, just how free-spirited the agricultural sector is. And that is how someone like yourself can end up, ironically, in a position of power and still be a shit disturber, still be someone who, generally speaking, both inspires confidence from people like me, but also maybe inspires fear and irritation from other leaders within this. How has that been for you in terms of your experience as a leader, but to your point, your experience as a radical?
Interesting, because I took the opportunity for a decade or so when I was the CEO of a not-for-profit agricultural society, because I believe the education of my fellow citizens, my fellow Ontarians, was vitally important, particularly in light of the fact that most people are 3 to 4 generations removed from a farm. I put this out there without a moment's hesitation. I am actually a citiot. I have no farming background. My heritage has 0 farming background. None of my ancestors from basically 100 plus years ago, they weren't farmers. They were salesmen, merchants, murderers, horse thieves, the entire thing, but they were not farmers. And I always thought that the sector required a voice that needed to be able to be heard crystal clear. My starting of my career, I was a journalist, an editor. And at that point, you learn very much that reality is how you can position it. I always learned that reality, what was the line I used to use? Perception is reality. And that's the ugly truth about dealing with an industry that has over 250 crops and livestock raised. Everybody's crop and livestock is vitally important to them without looking at the bigger picture of what needs to be done. Being a radical? No, I'm just a free voice I'm a free voice in a realm that is very difficult for people to understand, that fundamentally these are the roots of everything, and that's pun not intended, but they're the roots of everything that go through. Farmers are the greatest innovators that are out there. We don't acknowledge that. Farmers are the last bastion of human communication because they don't do this very much. This is not something that is in their bailiwick. They're the ones that still phone call shows and complain about things that are going on, but they do it quietly. And they are the coffee house guys that they want to see what their neighbors are doing, but at the same time, they're an entire group of individuals and that don't like change. And change frightens them. And change is the one thing that I believe is a necessity to being able to break through to that next side.
And let me push back on one thing you said there, which is that they're quiet. I don't think they're quiet anymore. I think the power of social media, the power, quite frankly, of the smartphone, that they're able to have access to a global audience. And in particular, because there are so many farmers online, they have access to an audience of like minds, an audience of people who work the kind of same field, perhaps even, I shouldn't say field in the literal sense, but the same industry. And I think your point about perception is even more important today, especially when it comes to issues like policies, especially when it comes to leadership. And your point about having a background in journalism is not something we should gloss over, because on the one hand, I think it does teach critical thinking skills. But it's also given you a kind of media literacy where, yes, I'm saying a lot of people in the sector use social media to communicate, to talk. You also watch the news in a way that I think not a lot of people still do. And I'm curious whether you think that the leadership in this sector, to use a Bob Dylan line, there's something happening here and you don't know what it is. Do you, Mr. Jones, the ballad of a thin man? Does that apply to the leadership sector today? Does that kind of speak to the way, to my point, I'm saying farmers are getting louder and they are afraid of change, and it's causing, I think, a kind of crisis of leadership, certainly a crisis of legitimacy. That's a bit of a rambling setup for you there, Jamie, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts as someone who's not only been on the ground in the sector, but who as a journalist, a recovering journalist, can see the media sphere in a critical perspective.
Yeah, you know what? Like everything else in society, we tend to get and I'm going to put it this way, we tend to fall into the algorithms that we want to. I don't, because I can't base an opinion that I'm working towards or a fundamental fact that I'm working towards only on my own perception. I need to be able to look at everything that goes through, and I need to be able to connect the dots that go through it. And that's from a historical all the way through to a future perspective. That's the thing that leaders forgets about, is that there are those that actually looked at the past. There are solutions all the way through. They just don't want to do it because they're trying to make their mark. The one thing I learned, really an awkward for me to say given the introduction you'd thrown at me, is that as a journalist, I don't have much of an ego. I'll be a shit disturber. I have no problems admitting that. I'll be a radical. I'll be anything along the way, but I don't have much of an ego because I'm not looking for a legacy. I'm not trying to make myself something that I'm not. I've always been like this, and people have found that. They don't need to go back 5 years and realize I haven't changed. I haven't changed in the entire time that I was here, because fundamentally, I think the evolution of what I was supposed to be was that I was supposed to be somebody that was the one that said a statement in the room. And there's always people that always want to say it, but they never do. They're afraid. They're scared that their funding's going to go. They're afraid that they're not going to be able to have an appropriate response. And I'll reflect this back as a journalist. I used to give people lots of rope to hang themselves because it's more fun to do it that way, to let them do it to themselves than for me to point out the obvious. And by having somebody take as much rope as they want, you know what? That tree branch, it's hitting there for a reason. And that's how I used to reflect upon what was there. So when I look at what needs to be done and what's happened and where the realities are, is that a lot of people talk about scale, big, everything like doesn't work. And it's not going to work because I'll pick on our southern neighbors. You've got a nation that is clearly in turmoil right now. Their farming population, they lost over 300,000 farms in 2025 alone. That's a huge number. And when you're 4% of the world's population, which I think they're running around 4 or 4.1%, and that's not a big chunk of the population to have a conversation. They use somewhere, and I'm looking at this one, they use in excess of 25 to 30% of all the pesticides that are constructed or built around. This is why there's a big push right now to reinvigorate the pesticide industry in the U.S. is because they're big users of it. But if they don't have it, their entire society fails. These are the leadership things that we don't look at. We don't look at how they position it. We don't want to have that conversation because we've been able to ride the coattails of this for so long that we've forgotten that we're a pretty independent nation ourselves. And we're not just drawers of water, hewers of wood. We are actually a really innovative, regional-based country. And I think that's where you go back long enough and you can see that there were huge differences. And that's why I keep pushing the way that I do, because I don't want to be an agrarian society, Jess. I really don't. I like the fact that we are diversified enough to be able to have it, but I don't think we're diverse enough. And I'll let the big boys play what they want, but I like my small and mid-sized farms. I like the people that are out there, and I'm more encouraged now than ever to see young people coming on, but they're not being given that opportunity. And that's what stresses me out the most, is the fact that we, as a industry, aren't looking at how we make succession happen, how we make the role of people coming into the sector a reality. And more importantly, that there is nothing out there because it's all based around land. It's all based around the ideas that they can't, and I put this in air quotes, that they can't have the ability to buy into a 100-acre farm at, say, $30 million. And who can blame them?
You raise a bunch there, and I in particular want to come back to the succession issue and the youth empowerment issue, because I think that also has to be a recurring mandate of this podcast. But you also highlighted something I want to tease out in terms of a paradox, also here on this podcast. And that's the idea that on the one hand, there is a culture of innovation, especially in the prairies. It's remarkable how, as I've started to really learn about not just the history of agriculture, but the history of innovation in agriculture, the extent to which Canada has consistently been a global leader. And there is a desire, certainly within the sector, to continue to embrace change. But the execution of that seems to be where the dysfunction is. To your earlier provocation that you've been here for decades, people are having the same conversation, but they're not actually implementing the change that they claim they want. Of course, that might be tied to our point about young people and our point about getting new people into the system. But no, I want to hold on. I want to throw you a hard ball or a fastball, and I want to throw it right down the middle of the plate, and you can decide whether you want to swing and miss or whether you want to hit it. But it strikes me that the paradox that people aren't really talking about, but that you seem to be getting closest to, is the conflict that exists within the sector. That everybody tries to present a kind of narrative of unity, right? A narrative of, yeah, we all get along, we're all on the same page. But you scratch the surface and you actually have a lot of legitimate disagreement, a lot of legitimate differences. And I think those things are growing, and I think they're becoming even more pronounced. So before we skate off into the feel-good stuff of saying all the things that we'd like to see, I would love to hear your thoughts on how do we deal with conflict within the sector? And how do we convene conversations amongst people who despise each other, who have difficulty respecting each other? But I would assume you agree with this. If you don't, I'd love to hear that we do need to be talking to each other, that we do need to find a way to have the either ends of the polarized society, the divided practices of how to pursue agriculture and how to prepare food, sitting down and having a conversation, because otherwise we just get the dysfunction.
Okay, so you wanted, you put a fastball over there. I like the baseball analogy. I love the game. I coached and did that for years. So here's your hardball, fastball response, and it's going over the fence. Agriculture lacks a plan. Agriculture lacks a plan because everybody's commodity is just as important as everybody else's commodity. It doesn't matter how you look at it. Everybody is scratching for fewer dollars being handed out by governments to be able to take a look at it. He is struggling to be able to figure out what their own niche is or how they're able to do it. And we've done this for decades. It's not something that's new. This is something that is problematic all the way through. Back in 2003, 2004, an irritation came up, and we had the One Voice in Ontario where we rallied 20,000 plus farmers and brought tractors down to Queen's Park and had all kinds of chaos for the then newly elected Liberal government. The organization that took the lead on it, I won't say which one, presented the minister, then Minister Steve Peters, with the demands that they were looking at. One voice. Jess, one voice. We're supposed to speak with one voice. There are universal issues that impact livestock, crops, grains and oilseeds. It doesn't matter. There are lots of universal issues that look at this. And this is how far back it goes for me that there's a source of issues, because they presented him with 9 individual commodity-driven problems. They didn't do one voice. They broke it down into sectors. Maybe it was 8 or 9 different things that they wanted resolved. And I'd happened to be good friends at the time with the minister, and we're sitting there with a couple of his cabinet colleagues, and I'm not going to burst anybody's bubble. We're having a drink and a smoke inside one of the offices on the second level of Queen's Park, and he's, what the hell am I supposed to do with this? And I said, I don't know, because that's not one voice. We didn't speak with one voice, and that was really a problem. When you have food system developments, when you see new websites that are going out, when you see answering the question and you're exempting other things along the way, when you only talk about things that are problematic for you, i.e. livestock, oh, this is a big one that comes up because people are always looking at the big stuff along the way. But funny thing is that food systems require fruits and vegetables. That's what Canada's National Food Guide states, is it's not the U.S. We're not putting livestock and protein at the top. We're actually doing the right thing and doing it on a health benefit. So we disagree on health because they aren't smart enough to look at what the realities are. And I think that's where everything links back to. If we were to look at this properly, they would have developed a 30-year plan or a 20-year plan. Instead, they do things based around electoral cycles, just like government. And that's why inevitably we fail, is because every 4 years, we're looking at who the next party is. That's going to be the one that's there. What are going to be the mandates that are coming into it? And inevitably, that's why they fail, is because they don't look beyond it. And because they don't look beyond, they don't care. And because
So
they don't care, it's only about what they want in the terms of their. If I hear one more organization say they need $400 or $500 million to satisfy their farmers, I'm going to puke.
So that begs two follow-up questions, and I'll give you the latter one first, and then ask the one that I want you to answer first. And the latter one is, how does the agricultural sector and the food sector become recognized as the basis for society itself, and not an afterthought when we think about government funding, let alone cabinet priorities? But before you answer that question, Jamie, I gotta push back and say, do you really think it's possible to speak with one voice? I hear everybody say that, and I don't dispute with you the political power in doing so. But in today's day and age, how would you achieve that, assuming you had the mandated resources to attempt it?
I'll throw that right back at you. Not a problem. You want to speak with one voice? What's the biggest problem that they list all the time? Red tape, regulations. They talked about this for 30 years. They've talked about this. You want to go at this one as a one voice scenario? And you put in a rural secretariat. You find a way that looks at it as a means of getting it through the lens. That's how you get that answers the first question of how do you get effective within cabinet? We won't be effective in cabinet. It won't even depend. Look, let's play political Colors 101. Liberals know that the farmers aren't going to vote for them. There'll be a small percentage, but that's it. So they don't need to worry about the rural countryside because that's conservative. The conservatives don't look at it as being important because they already know they've got that vote. That's the reality of politics that you play in. So now you have to move that step beyond and say, how can you affect opportunities to do it? And the one thing that I'll throw out there is it goes back 2 questions ago where you said, should we have the opinions of everybody? Yes. But we now live in a world, and you, the one that threw this at me, we now live in a world where you're saying, hey, how can we talk with the one voice? As I said, a rural secretariat works because they look at the lens of everything that goes through. Every piece of policy, every piece of regulation would be looked at in the view of how it impacts the farming community and the rural countryside. This isn't 2024. That's the last year in Canada that we were 50% rural, 50% urban. That was the very last year that we had that. 2026, they do the census and they realize that it's now starting to shift. It's 50, 51.3, and that's the last year that we had an even opportunity to do it. Now it's 9% of the countryside is rural, and the rest of it's urban. So now we have to have the conversations with the city folk because they're the ones that are driving policy, and they're the ones that are getting the attention of all of the politicians because everybody knows that the 144,000 voters that are sitting in whatever XYZ riding don't matter if you're sitting in the middle of Saskatchewan. That's not taken seriously. So first you take the look at the rural secretariat.
If I'm hearing you correctly, the ability to speak with one voice is literally a requirement of leadership. That what we require are leaders who either have, to your point about the rural secretariat, the organizational capacity, or to what I'm trying to argue, the ability to synthesize, not necessarily please everybody, but to articulate an opportunity, a policy concept, a demand, a need that rallies enough people behind it and is able to get the desired response from whoever it is it's being directed at. Am I reading you correctly in that?
You're reading me correctly because honestly, Jesse, what we've got now, we've got a world where you can look at artificial intelligence, for example. That was a big player that came in. I'm not going to name names inside the ministry or anything like that, but AI policy in Canada sucks. It blows chunks, and that's a reality. But that is how you can fix some of the ongoing issues with inside agriculture itself, is because AI can be used to synthesize down, to give a synopsis. I see this all the time when I'm looking at a report or something. They ask for a synopsis. I don't do that because I'm still old school. I still print stuff. But when it comes to a synopsis or a language to be able to do it, I'm sitting inside my computer with literally 60 or 70 different reports, everything from the Speller report in the early 2000s to the Odyssey report to all these other reports to the Barton report. All these reports that exist, and we don't use our capacity to be able to fix the stuff that's there because we're too stupid to function.
Okay, now this isn't fair. I'm throwing you fastballs and you're just lobbing them over the plate for me to hit it over the park. These pitches are too easy if you're going to set me up with AI so easily with that. And I agree with what you're saying. Absolutely. But again, I got to come back to something else you said that I thought was brilliant, and I want you to double down on it because I think this is an example of you being a dissident. And you don't think you're a dissident. You think you're employing common sense, which you are. But to employ common sense in a moment of incredible dysfunction is to be a dissident. Do you believe, dear Jamie, that the urban voting electorate requires a far greater literacy and understanding of where their food comes from? And I ask it in such a way because I've been rather shocked at how many people within the leadership of the agri-food sector not only have a dim view of, how you put it, the idiots, but they don't actually believe that the urban voters should necessarily know where their food comes from, nor do they believe that they will. Why do you see this differently?
You opened this one up, so I will do this. There was a recent conference, won't mention it, where the best of the best, the brightest of the brightest were gathered in one room. 1,000 people in Ottawa, all holding hands, singing Kumbaya. And there were 30 of us farmers that were inside that fucking room at the time. You want to have a conversation about lack of conciseness, lack of intelligence? If you're making stuff that wants to go forward, if you're talking about investment, if you're talking about the ability to look beyond your own borders in the growing season of 1 year, then you have to have the farmers there themselves. And the other reason is they didn't have consumers. This was a bunch of people that were all like-minded, that were thinking to themselves, they can do all this stuff. And the reality is, I heard one statement there from somebody that was down in New Zealand. And what they had done is they created an apple specifically for a market. They created an apple specifically for China. It took them 15 years to grow a specific variety of an apple using their research and marketing, but now they have a market all to themselves that the Chinese love. We are that inanely stupid that we don't look at ourselves like that. And I've got to tell you, so this goes back to what I had said, the number one killer of creative, innovative concepts on the farming community side is usually red tape. It's usually something that people don't think about. It's usually the idea that we've got a premier that says the province is open for business. I would argue it's not. I would argue that we put in our own inherent barriers that have led to the demise of what we've called this creative concept. Great. AI is out there, but AI didn't come from Canada. We're just going to evolve and rule with it. And we're not going to get to a point where we should be leaders of what's there. We used to be leaders. And we're not. We don't have that ability anymore. When you talk about how we should look at this stuff, 25 years ago, I was arguing about interprovincial trade barriers. And they said, oh yeah, we're going to fix that. They just did. And they said, we're going to move all these barriers except for 3 key areas. They're not going to do it in alcohol. They're not going to do it in finance. And they're not going to do it in food. Then what the hell's the point? What the hell is the point of removing the barriers that would instantly free up, I think it's around 13% of our GDP to move across? BC wines coming into Ontario. And conversely, then we're not talking about all the little issues about movement of product. We're not talking about country of origin then. Now we're talking about opportunities to be able to feed a nation regionally with all the stuff that we've got going on. But we can't do that because we don't think like that.
So let me come back to what essentially, I agree, you did hit my fastball out of the park. But I still think you struggled with the pitch. I think the reason you hit it out of the park is that you just happen to be a very talented hitter. But allow me to try to throw that pitch again in a different way. Because what you just did there was very rare, both in policy circles, but also in leadership circles. You spoke without ideology. You talked about different policies without couching it into partisan rhetoric, without using ideological buzzwords that people often rely upon to show that they're on the right side. And the first fastball question I asked you is, how do you get people who don't like each other in the same room so we can work out our differences, so we can have these conversations? And I'll modify that again. How can we have creative policy conversations that look at the challenges we face, that come up with innovative policy solutions without devolving to partisans, without devolving to ideology, but instead looking at them as systems? Because that's why I love farming, and that's why I love farmers, right? They think about systems. They look at systems. Their lives depend upon systems. I would love to be talking about food and farming and all this stuff as systems without a lot of the extra baggage that comes with it. And correct me if I'm wrong, I feel that's what you're doing.
That's the direction I've always been going in. And again, this is not, I used to dress in black for a reason, Jesse. I'd go to Queen's Park or Ottawa and I dressed for black for a reason. You didn't see me with a red or blue tie or a green tie or an orange tie. You didn't see me doing that because honestly, at the end of the day, you have to be able to be yourself walking into something. And that's, I think, what we've forgotten about is it was interesting that we're having this conversation today because we can't. You and I talked about how we would get together on this. And personally, I would rather have sat down at your property, having a beer and sitting there outside with the dogs running around and having that conversation. We now have the ability to do what we're doing, but right across the country. We now have the ability to set it up and put a question out there that 1,000 people can respond to, whether they're farmers or whether they're from different sides of the spectrum or whether they're from something else. Social media has showing these algorithms, but if we change the algorithm for what we're looking at, if we eliminate the concept that there's got to be a partisan thing, then you ask the right questions and you can get responses based around what their area is reflected with. Is there a need for irrigation within Alberta? Yeah, there is. But do they have the resources and the water for it? No. Do they have the infrastructure? No, they're struggling with this. And it's not because they've done things bad. It's because they're dealing with issues that we're not dealing with in Ontario. Is there a way of finding transportation to justify being able to put local abattoirs throughout the country? Yeah, there are, but we don't have the provincial backbone. And I think that's where another thing is that you need to look at is whether or not there's a belief that we do have the backbone to do it. I would counter for everything that you're saying, that there's a lot of armchair warriors out there. There's a lot of people that like to hide behind the anonymity of what they do, and they have a really good rapport of being able to do that. I'm not anonymous. People know who I am based around what I've done. And I'm not happy about everything that I've done. I'll be honest with you. I've got a reputation for what it is, but my reputation is sometimes in error. I will fight fights that I need to do, but I will not inflict a partisan role on anything because I don't believe in that. And I believe in the only way that we can resolve stuff is to have that broader perspective, that broader ability to bring everything together. That's where I see the AI being able to do this, because now you can universally take this information and you can put it on a platform and you can have everybody take a look at it and they can synthesize through and you'll get all the responses. And it doesn't matter what your leaning is, left, center, far left, far right. It won't matter because keywords will be developed out of that algorithm that'll look at what the realities are. And that's how you do this, is you need to be smarter, and we're not. Quite frankly, as I said to start this, we don't have a plan. We're always reactive in agriculture. And it's not agriculture, it's farming and food, man. That's what we do, is farming and food. There isn't anything around that. Everything else we can figure out. But agriculture is now beyond the perspective of what most people think it is. It is not mom and pop kettle. It is not American Gothic. It is not what's there. We are talking about farmers that use GPS before GPS was found inside cars. We are talking about drone technology and the ability to use infrareds all the way through to highlight nutritional values. Like, we're way beyond the scope and scale of just putting bullshit onto a field and hoping something grows.
And you also, I think, made a crucial point in the sense that you've been a shit disturber for essentially your life, certainly your professional career, and you've done it under your own name, right? You're not anonymously posting crap out there. You're doing so with your reputation on the line. And I find that is generally true of farmers, that while there are a lot of people saying nasty things online without using their name, farmers tend to have the courage to stand behind that name. And I think that's why they are already on social media, organizing amongst themselves, amongst issues that are important to them on social media. And I think it's important to try to create a space, to try to find a platform that reinforces the sector rather than reinforces Facebook or reinforces Instagram. I do want to come back to two other things that you've brought up earlier. And the first, which kind of aligns slightly with what we're talking about, is young people and empowering young people, because that kind of fits into your category of things we've been saying for decades but have not actually done anything about. And you alluded to it, that part of it is, of course, land, which is more expensive than it ever has been. And that's certainly tied to concentration of the industry, whether in the food side or in the agriculture side, because it's not just necessarily young farmers. It might be young entrepreneurs who want to run a restaurant or want to create a food company. In all cases, if they don't really have the bank of mom and dad, it may be very difficult for them to get into the industry. So I suspect this is something that you've probably been thinking about for as long as you've been in the sector and have been frustrated with the rhetoric without the action. I'm really curious to hear your indictments or certainly your thoughts in this particular area.
Well, yeah. So this has irritated me forever and a day. I think, again, this is where for some of the regulatory stuff in succession planning with taxation issues, with all of the capital gains crap and everything else that gets thrown through on this stuff, that's where a rural secretariat would have been able to look at it and say, pull this line out and say, that doesn't work for farmers. And if you want the farming community to be able to sustain itself and continue, these are the areas that you need to do, because that was a huge thing that came up over the last couple of years. That's first. Second, we are, from a federal government perspective, and this is a fun part, because I never grow tired of somebody that says, oh, with climate change and the growing degrees that are going to be increased in the north for areas like Sault Ste. Marie and Thunder Bay, we're going to be able to grow all the food that we need, and we can get rid of the Southern Ontario part because that's going to be too hot. And then you look back and you go, are you ever stupid? Because you know what? Yeah, the growing degrees, the days will change, but one thing that we don't have is soil. That's something that's not there. So now you have to rethink about every thought that you've had about what farming is. And I think that's why we struggle, is because everybody thinks farming is just a guy sitting in a field on a tractor. And I'll use the analogy of he spends 8 hours planting the crops for a 100-acre field, sprays it once, goes to Florida or Key West to be able to take 8 months off, comes back, harvests for another 16 hours, then that's it. And that's the farmer thought. That's not. We need to do so much more to be able to think about what's going on and make those improvements along the way. First off, I'm opening up the federal side of things. They've got land. Let's get some of the people out there. If they want to learn this stuff, let them. The thing I did with where I'd worked previously at Country Heritage Park was I opened up 11 acres to community farming because there were people that wanted to learn. Of that, I'd say about probably a dozen of them have gone on to do other things, including working in Africa to help countries that are outside of Canada develop their own agricultural side. That's a real moment that we can look back at and say, okay, they hadn't had that experience because they came from Toronto, but they wanted to do this. And that's where they learned, is by doing it. We need mentorship programs. And I think that's what's really missing and absent, is the ability to mentor somebody, because it's always changing. And mentorship, by the way, Jess, runs both sides.
Totally.
The things I've learned along the way are not just that young people can learn from old people can learn more specifically from young people.
100%.
And I saw that time again, working through a volunteer system, through farmers that were coming out of Toronto, through Six Nations that were doing the work with us, that they actually have an impact on older guys that didn't think they could change, that didn't think that they learned anything along the way, that didn't understand. I remember a specific example of a Syrian refugee, a 16-year-old boy telling one of the old guys that was sitting at a table crabbing at him, because he didn't speak English properly. He had the grasp of it, but he didn't speak it properly. And the guy said, this is all I was able to pick up. I was in an internment camp for 4 years. And that one floored him, because they don't think like that. Outside experience is a huge factor, and our sector is really isolated sometimes. Yeah, you talk about the fact that farmers are getting a voice, but we've never had the kind of voice that's required to be able to go backwards and forwards. So we need to talk to everybody that's not there. We need to talk to the youth and say, we have opportunities. We need to talk to city folk and say, here's what we need to be able to do. And we need to educate on the universal side. But more importantly, we need to put aside our pre-justified concepts and conceit and move forward with an idea that, you know what? Yeah, this isn't how things were thought to be. This isn't 1901 where there's 2.6 billion people. There's nearly 10 billion people on the world right now. So let's figure out how to do this properly and go backwards.
And this is why I really wanted to get you on this podcast in the kind of early part of us building it up, because I almost feel that part of what we're doing right now is we're creating KPIs. We're creating key performance indicators of whether the leadership in this country has the capability to step up to the challenges that it faces. You highlight, I think, an important role of public education and literacy, which I keep bringing back up, which I do want to come back to. But you also allow me to bring up, I think, another subject, which you raised earlier and that I'm quite passionate about, which is the role of small farmers, the role of small and medium-sized farmers. And I am, admittedly, a newbie when it comes to agriculture, right? To your point, none of my parents or grandparents or great-grandparents were in the agricultural sector. And I'm here because I want to be. I'm here because I think it's the right place and the right time for artificial intelligence. But I also come from the kind of startup world, the technology world, the entrepreneurial world. And the thing you understand about technology, the thing you understand about healthy business ecosystems is you need startups. You need new entrants. You need new blood. You need new perspectives. And they have to be small. Yeah, you want them to scale up if they work, but you also want a critical mass of really small experimental farms doing crazy stuff, because they're the ones who are going to come up with new ideas. They're the ones who are going to do research on their own without waiting from funding from some ministry or whatnot. And this seems to run contrary to the prevailing wisdom that big is better, that we shouldn't worry about small farmers, and city people don't want to farm. They'd prefer to be safe in their completely controlled environments. And yet I know so many people in Toronto who would do anything to become farmers, who watch homesteaders on YouTube with envy, as if it's almost like farm porn. And again, it strikes me that this is a huge policy opportunity that could not only give the agricultural industry a kind of vibrancy on the small scale that leads to all sorts of positive economic activity, but you could also have a rural economic development in terms of, I go to my local feed store and I'm buying hay from local farmers, and I would like to be sourcing all my stuff from local suppliers and having my animals go to a local abattoir. Am I being ludicrous here, Jamie? Or is my sense of certainly my generation, if not younger members, does it align with kind of what you've been anticipating or desiring in terms of empowering small farmers as a whole?
No, I don't think it's anticipating. I think it's not even, I think it's just the right way of approaching it. If we're going to have and I use the word sustainability not in the environmental sense in here, the word is sustainability in an economic sense. And the problem is that the big guys have shown all you need to do is look right across the southern border and see what a exceptionally large livestock operation did to a town. Actually, 4 different towns. And it's because the trade imbalance exists, blah, 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 blah. The politics is there, blah, blah, blah. But the reality is it failed. It failed the people that were there. It failed everybody except for one group, and that was the shareholders. The shareholders didn't take a look at anything and say, oh yeah, no, that's okay. Because when you get all the big problems, The big problems are because people didn't see all the things. When you're small and mid-size, you can determine where the problems are. When I created a hydroponic aquaponic system, it took me 14 months. Not because I'm slow, not because I didn't understand the science, but because there were mistakes to be made and to be had where I needed to learn from. That's how you get better at what you do. I never, in my entire life, as either a coach or player or anything else, I never learned from winning. I learned from losing. I learned from the mistakes that were made along the way. And
can I jump in there real quick?
Mistakes now. Yeah.
I think that's a very important point. And I just want to tease that out because I've been thinking a lot, and you alluded to this at the start when you were framing the almost the valorous role of the farmer. And I personally have been thinking about how farming is the last frontier of freedom because you have the room to make mistakes. You have the room to do trial and error. Like I taught myself last year how to weld and how to make a robot, which when I was doing it, I thought I'd never be able to do this in the city because there'd be too much shame. There'd be too many people telling me I'm doing it wrong, and I wouldn't have the space to do it where only my dogs could see me almost kill myself. And again, I think farmers take that for granted. I think city people don't even understand what that kind of freedom is like. But the freedom to fail is at the heart of the entrepreneurial process. If you look at the success and the mantra of kind of Silicon Valley, it's fail early, fail often. And yet most people don't get that social license. And I think you hit it on the nose in terms of this is how we learn. So allow me to dig into my crazy pitches and throw you another fastball. How do we do that in the policy space? Because if there's anywhere that people are afraid of failure, let alone afraid of looking like a fool or saying something dumb, it's the policy space. And yet, I think what you're arguing, what I'm hearing, is we got to say some dumb stuff before we actually are able to get to the point of having really smart things to say.
You know what? Policy failure has been around for 1,000 years. What policy failure hasn't failed along the way? Everybody thinks they have great ideas. And this goes to the point of being reactive, not proactive. They're afraid to put stuff out that they think would be functional and work. I know you stopped me about the youth, but you know what? We're going to be sitting there with youth unemployment probably hovering around 15, 16%. So I'm back in 1981, for me, looking at 17% unemployment, 23% on my first loan for a car, interest rate, and realizing that I have to do all of these things just to continue on. And there's no freebies, there's no gimmies anymore. There's no what they used to call entry level. You have to be smart enough to be able to look at where everything is. Policies are going to fail. But my biggest problem is the fact that government continues to this day. It doesn't matter whether you're municipal, provincial, or federal. They continue to try and pick winners and losers. And government is not the intelligent body that should be the one doing this. Mm-hmm. I think what should be done is that we need to be able to have an opportunity to be able to continue to make the mistakes that are out there, to continue to do it, not with a safety net so much as an ability to look at it with a clear eye and present that as knowledge. That's knowledge gained. You make a mistake, that should go out there and people should be able to talk about that. And yet the one thing I learned about farmers, and this was really early, is that they don't want to talk about their mistakes. That's not something that they want to deal with because they've made the mistake and they clearly don't want to do it. And they're not going to tell their neighbors that they just blew $20,000 on a packer that went bankrupt and started up across the street. They're not going to say anything like that.
I think that also is why the small farmer ends up playing an outsized role, because if the stakes are low, there's less shame in admitting that mistake. And this is why, again, there is this phenomena on YouTube, this phenomena of social media of the smaller farmer becoming popular. It's because they're transparent about their mistakes. They admit their mistakes. Part of their role is educational. So I suspect there may be a culture change going on. Oh, you wanted to continue.
But I'll jump into this one. There is. The smaller guys are and have done what they're doing because they look at it as a lifestyle and they made choices along the way. As well, they're usually backed. This is the one thing that we've always learned is that farming in Canada means that you need a second job off farm. She's usually your wife who's a teacher or a professor, a nurse, anything along the way, because it supplements the ability of the farmer to be able to do the job of growing. And at the same time, the farmer often has a second job. These are the educational opportunities to be able to take that real life thing and do it as an opportunity to look at career, right? It's not a lifestyle. This is not, I got small acreage, you got small acreage. You're doing what you're doing because you're having fun. I'm planting trees because we're environmental in our bend. We see the inherent value of having trees to be able to repopulate. But policy change needs to reflect an educational component as well. And not just within the scholastic system. This, Jess, they took away farming as a career option. That's not inside. You go to a counselor and say, I want to be a farmer. They're not going to let you do it. There's nothing that's there for them. And yet farming is the one jack of all trades opportunity to be able to showcase that, excuse me, you don't need to follow everything by the book. And that speaks to that freedom. And it's you never set your own hours. There's not somebody there that's got a punch clock when you're farming. You do what you want to do. You want to get up at 4 a.m. and feed the animals? Go for it.
Don't
you
have
want to
to
get
commute.
up at 7? Do it? Do it.
I do think that you're speaking both out of a sense of frustration, but at the same time, perhaps even yourself being corrupted by the larger narrative of framing. Because I'm not so sure about that lifestyle argument. I agree a lot of people tell themselves that. I agree the affordability crisis that affects everybody compels people to get other work. But the only reason that I have a small acreage is that's all that I could afford. And we are certainly working this small acreage as intensely as we can so that we can grow our agricultural operation the same way I suspect that any farmer wants to grow their agricultural operation. But also we want to do so in a way that doesn't kill us, that doesn't make us beholden to hostile interests. That is where I see technology playing a very unique role in empowering that small farmer. But to your point, it also requires less regulations. It requires a more favorable policy environment. And of course, as a newbie to the ag sector, I find it hilarious that you'll see, for example, the grain farmers and the supply management farmers picking fights with each other. But both benefit tremendously from the existing policy environment, either through the supply management or through crop insurance. And again, these are things that I think the general public doesn't really understand. But once you start coming into the sector, it's complicated. And the policy environment is fraught with all sorts of different agendas, different interests, which is why I find this whole speaking with one voice thing daunting challenge, but also why I find these narratives to be so entrenched and why it is so difficult to have these conversations about leadership. As we start to wrap, only because my back teeth are starting to sing anchors away due to the size of my growing bladder, how do you see the kind of landscape ahead? What do you think is the tactics, the strategy for the leader who desires change, who really wants to see the action happen in spite of the talk that we've seen go around in circles?
You know what? What did you call me, a dissident?
Yes.
Dissidents don't write policy, yet I do. Because I think that's the only correct way to do it. I also believe that, and I stepped away from it, I probably shouldn't have. I stayed in touch with a lot, but you have to have a passion for it as well, Jesse. And the passion is not just about, it's not just about the farmers, it's not looking at that legacy side. It's not trying to do anything that builds it. It's trying to find solutions. And not many people are solution driven anymore. There are a lot of them that just like the status quo. There's a lot of them that I call lunch pail warriors. They come in, they punch the clock, they're there for 7.5 hours, they get their pay and they go home and that's it. And they don't think about this stuff. I think about this stuff. I think about this stuff all the time because there's 4 things that people need. And one of them's food, air, water, shelter, food. It's not that complicated to figure out. Then you look at the farm politics get in the way, and then the real life politics get in the way. And then the farmers themselves get in their own way because you've got a 63-year-old farmer that his sons want to take over, but he's out there saying this isn't the way you do it. And I know this because I had all these examples in my face when I was working with the guys, and still to this day, you look back and they go, look at the young ones. That's why they get frustrated. If you've got a secession plan, work it through or buy them out or do whatever. And I happened to bump into a really old friend of mine a couple of days ago. And he had bought his dad out 13 years ago. And it almost broke him at the time. Now he's very successful again because he did things the way that he thought was in the best interest.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, Jesse, that's the kind of inspiration that gets me through on any of those days that's sunny and warm and everything else. It's because there are people that still want to make a difference out there. He's got a lovely operation down in Townsville area. He's happy. He's got a family. He's got everything that you talk about for a small acre or small mid-sized acre property for a guy that wants to do this. And yet he still contributes to his local federation. He still contributes to the conversations that are out there. And we keep the politics out of it because at the end of the day, he's still looking at how to find solutions, not just on his farm, but on other farms. He looks at the agritourism side. That is rife with regulations that just screw you up the yahoo. He looks at the pick your own, where theft is now the number one issue out there. You want to, as a farmer, have enough hope that people aren't going to rob you blind. And yet that's what the number one problem now for pick your owns are. And I can see a day when we're not going to have pick your owns, which then actually causes more problems because now you don't have an educational basis to prove to people that potatoes grow in the ground.
You got the solution earlier in the episode. It's called AI, right? You could have someone leaving the field and it says, thank you for paying for the basket in your front. The strawberries in your backpack will be an additional $50 automatically deducted from your debit card. I'm being facetious, but your point is valid. I want to ask you a kind of selfish question.
Go.
As I move forward with this podcast, is there a particular question you would have me asking leaders?
Oh, that's wide open, man. You'd ask why they like the status quo. You could ask why they don't listen to others. Why they say that they're there for the entire sector, but they're not. They're very much involved with only their own side. And a lot of the farm leadership are only in it for themselves on their own farm operation. And that's something I've known forever. So they're doing stuff that'll favor their own operations along the way. And they lack that perspective of being able to look at the entirety of the sector, the entirety of the country. And I can tell you that they stymie themselves because they're stuck back in the 1970s, early 1980s, just before they had the farm crisis, because those were good days. And that's what you talk to a farmer that's been doing this long enough. Their line, Jesse, isn't, I want to look about what's changed. Their line is always, God, I wish it was 1978. That was the best year that I had for apples. The price was phenomenal. My crop was spectacular, and my neighbor's crop failed.
Nostalgia is a very intoxicating drug. I think much of contemporary politics is with it. But before we conclude, anything else you'd like to say that you feel we haven't got to in this podcast?
No, man, I'm going to hell anyway, so I don't worry about any of this stuff. Now I'm on an express elevator, so, I'm just speaking exactly what we had talked about before, because when I heard you speak in Niagara, you said things that made sense and resonated with me, whereas the rest of the room, and I say this without a shred of issue, the rest of the room sometimes gets caught in their own status quo, so to speak. When they talked about 2050, they said the labor issue was there. And I remember this specifically. Their labor hasn't been born yet for 2050. Their labor is going to be the 18 to 21-year-old. We're 25 years away from 2050. Or 24 now. But this is a problem that they don't recognize their own finite inability to look beyond what they're thinking about. Like, where are you going to find that 60-year-old that they want to go harvest strawberries in the field? Go find them. But they ain't going to do it.
Again,
and this
here's
is
where
why
we
they
could
fail,
get-
is because they don't look at they don't look at their quagmires that they create themselves by getting stuck into a principle that they don't look beyond their own thing. They didn't look at AI or the ability to mechanize or to be able to do it. These are still people that, it's 1911 for me, maybe 1913, where the tractors are now just starting to come in, but everybody's fighting it because they like their horses and they understand that they can do it with a single furrow plow and they understand how they've done it. And this is how change works. And then 20 years go by and their tractor is now a bigger tractor and their neighbors are using a far bigger tractor and they're still on a horse and wondering why they're failing.
Thank you, Jamie. That's been a phenomenal talk. Our automated audience here has been enthralled with every step. I feel that one of the key takeaways from all of this is that leadership requires a certain amount of courage, both to call things the way you see it, but also to hear things that you don't like. And that certainly many of the leaders who are in the positions of power they are, if they're not willing to do those things, they're going to have a very difficult time. So thanks again, Jamie.
You're very welcome, Justin. You're absolutely right. It's the people that don't want to hear. I think it goes back. I'll do this real quick for you, but I think it goes back to what you had said. We need to hear all the voices in the room, even the ones that we disagree with.
Right on. What I love about conversations like this is that they refuse the polite fiction that everything in the agri-food sector is working the way it should. Jamie has spent decades close enough to the system to understand how it really operates. The good intentions, the institutional inertia, the quiet frustrations, and the moments when someone finally decides to say what others are thinking but won't say out loud. And that's the energy this episode carries. Because the future of agriculture will not be decided by the people who are comfortable with the status quo. It will, however, be shaped by the people willing to question it. The ones who challenge institutions, disrupt stale conversations, and insist that the sector be honest with itself about the road ahead. That kind of leadership is not always tidy. It's not always popular, but it sure is necessary. And if the future herd has a purpose, it's to bring those voices into the open. The rebels, the skeptics, the builders, and the people who care enough about agriculture to fight for something better. So if this conversation sparked ideas for you, share it with someone else who should also be part of this discussion. And I don't just mean people in the sector. I mean people who eat food too. Because that's really the point. That we shouldn't be making food in isolation. We should be making food with the people we share it with. Because that's the future of Canada. That's the future of Canadian food and farming. And it's not something we inherit. It's something we decide and build together.